Welcome to Brain in a Vat. This is a special episode because we have only one host on this episode, who's me, and I'm going to be interviewing two co-authors of a paper, um, Travis Timmerman and Kurt Blankschaen, about whether queer actors should be playing queer parts. Um, Kurt, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
We wanted to start off by looking at the case where Kit Connor plays a character named Nick Nelson. So it's in a coming of age story in Netflix where Nick Nelson is discovering that he's bisexual. And so fans really liked the story and were tweeting and posting on social media quite favorably about it. And that went on until the actor Kit Connor ended up being cast as a lead in a straight romantic comedy. And people ended up then kind of asking, are you really straight? Are you just kind of playing someone who's gay or bisexual in Heartstopper? And to his credit, Connor did his best to ignore them, but he was also fairly young when he was taking it. He was a minor, and I think he ended up being 18 when he finally declared on social media after being hounded by fans. Congrats, I'm back for a bit. I'm bi. Congrats on forcing an 18-year-old to out himself. I think some of you missed the point of the show. And we thought this was sort of a really interesting thought experiment because it got to the idea that's been kind of percolating a lot online with whether or not straight actors should be playing queer characters, and there's a lot of controversy around it. And we thought it was a really compelling thought experiment because it got to an area that really wasn't philosophically explored in a ton of detail. So that was sort of our thought experiment and kind of what motivated us to take up the project.
So I take it that, just a spoiler alert, that your conclusion is that queer actors need not play the roles of queer characters. So in other words, there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Um, and that's not the woke view at the moment. So the woke view is that you need to have some sort of match between the role of the character and that person's identity in their everyday lives, the actor's identity or the performer's identity. Why do you think that they're wrong?
Um, so that's correct. We end up arguing that it's morally permissible for straight actors to play queer characters. We focus on that as a kind of a case study, and so we end up arguing that while we think it's well intentioned and I think it's coming from a good place, we think that when we follow this kind of demand. So we distinguish between character authenticity, which is when the character in a story ends up accurately representing or plausibly representing what real world experiences would be like, and what the performer authenticity would be. So does that performer actually match the character's experiences in real life? We think that's a plausible demand, but it actually ends up putting a lot of marginalized performers into a harmful trilemma. So we think that it either means that they're going to have to come out before they're ready. So in the case of Kit Connor, they'll either then have to take the role without coming out or forego the role. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but we take each of those three options as sufficiently harmful. And even if someone were to say, no, 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 like, yes, those are bad, but they're just the cost of doing the right thing. We end up addressing some of those concerns a little bit later in the paper as well.
And if I could just add on to the woke framing of it, I don't think of the paper or the conclusion that we reach as either woke or anti woke, even though you're right that this goes against a position that many self described woke people would have. I sort of think of it as an argument consistent with woke concerns that leads to a conclusion that's in tension with what a lot of people think could be the case. So, this is, I think, hopefully something that people who would self describe as woke or not could get on board with the reasons that we identify, that is the trilemma that these actors would be subject to or that they are subject to with a result of the social pressure.
I think it's well worth exploring the trilemma, seeing whether those are the only options that could occur and how bad each of those is. But I just want to undercut it first by saying surely all of those options apply as problematic for the actor or the performer, but surely there's more people involved here than just the performer. So there's a lot of people who are going to be watching the movie, and there's also other performers that do or don't get the job. Surely if we were to create a different structure that benefits people who watch the movie more than it hurts the person who takes up the role, that would be better. So I just want to give an example. Some people love watching queer performers play queer characters for the reason that they feel represented. Um, why is that concern or that benefit outweighed by any problems that the performer has, that a straight performer has when they have to decide what to do with the role?
So I think that's a terrific question. And one of the things we first start off in the paper is by looking at sort of why what we called character authenticity matters so much. So we sort of trace a brief history of queer representation in film and popular media. And so, in many cases, one of the reasons we think that this does have a benefit is when, historically speaking, there really weren't many other positive representations. These negative representations, so portraying people as pedophiles, sexual predators, serial killers, social misfits, outcasts. All of that had a negative impact on the way society crafted laws. So we talk about how they were hunted down in society during the Pink Scare, concurrent with the Red Scare. But more directly to your question about benefit, we focus on the sort of shift that we see largely in the 90s and early 2000s, where we see characters in Will and Grace and Dawson's Creek portraying these really positive, sort of depth, deep characters. And it turns out that those really did have a positive impact on the way people thought about gay rights and gay people in general and sort of preceding for marriage equality. But one of the most important things we end up arguing for in the paper is that the actors who played those characters both were straight. The characters were ultimately what mattered. And so if that seems to have the kind of impact on the public, then it looks like character authenticity does have this kind of positive consequence in a way that's somewhat independent of performer authenticity.
Yeah, I agree with that, of course, because I was a co-author on the paper. But I want to add on a bit too. So I think there are hard trade-offs to be made in certain circumstances, and I don't want to shy away from that fact. But in this particular case, we give reason in the paper to think that there's not actually a tension here in terms of a trade-off. And the reason for that is because it's important to look not only at like what happens with a particular casting decision with respect to a piece of television or film or play, but the industry, the effects on the industry as a whole. And if we have a um, social norm that's strictly enforced that puts actors in this trilemma, it's reasonable to think that it's going to serve as a deterrent from actors with the marginalized sexuality from pursuing the industry in the first place. Because they know they'd either have to remain in the closet or feel compelled to come out to play roles that, by hypothesis, they'd be most suited to play because they would get the roles were it not for the social norm that forced them to disclose their sexual orientation. And having more people, that would create a bottleneck in the industry. Removing that bottleneck and getting more people with the marginalized sexual orientation in the industry in the first place will result in more people having power to create the sorts of projects that they want. And we cite a number of cases. People often come out on their own timeline just because, for instance, Kit Connor didn't want to do it when he was a teenager. Doesn't mean he wouldn't want to have done it when he was in his 20s as he is now, or in his 30s or beyond. So I am skeptical of the claim, even though it's intuitive. It's an empirical question, but I am antecedently skeptical of the claim that enforcing these norms are going to result in more marginalized characters with the actors with the marginalized sexual orientation playing characters with the marginalized sexual orientation. I think the net effect might actually be fewer, or maybe a smaller number of out actors playing the same number of roles rather than a larger number of actors playing a comparable number of roles across different productions.
Okay, I really like the Will and Grace example as an example where you've got character authenticity producing great effects where people feel represented and it satisfies audiences. Um, but maybe that was within a particular era. So maybe that wouldn't go down so well today. You might find less cheering for Will as a gay character if it's known that Will isn't gay. I think in real life he's not gay. as an actor, right? That was your point. Yeah, so I grew up with Will and Grace, and just seeing a gay character on TV was incredible. But I think today people watching may be more demanding. And I think if you're a consequentialist and you think that if you were to add up all the utils of all the viewers, it can't possibly be outweighed by the utils of the actor or all the actors even. So I don't think you could be a consequentialist and hold this position if there is a widespread view that the only way that viewers will find um, a character satisfying is if there's performer authenticity.
Yeah, so I think it's a plausible claim to be made that viewers will be most satisfied if there's character authenticity. I'm not as confident about that for performer authenticity. Now, that is, again, an empirical question, but there's still a number of cases where you have character authenticity that lacks performer authenticity, and there's no sort of noticeable or outspoken decrease in how much people found it enjoyable. And I think what's maybe there's many things to say about this, but I want to give a short answer. So I want to focus on two cases that we give in the paper. So one is people didn't know whether Kit Connor was actually bisexual. They could tell that there was character authenticity in his performance, but they were uncertain about whether there was performer authenticity, which is why they were demanding that that's the case. So that suggests that absent that additional information, it's not going to change what their enjoyment level is, unless they might think perhaps this is morally wrong for some reason. So now I'm angry that they cast a potentially straight character in a bisexual role. But if they were convinced by the argument that Kurt and I give, then that sort of preference would go away. The other thing is there's also cases where people who are not a member of the marginalized group in question play a character, and then many people find that it resonates with them. So we mentioned Natasha Lyonne in But I'm a Cheerleader, a very early film, small indie film in the late 90s, where she played a lesbian. And in a way, it was so well that many people still ask her to this day. I read an interview with her at the time that we wrote the paper a couple of years ago. That was continually asking about her sexuality because it seemed to be infused with character authenticity. So if you can't tell whether good actors have performer authenticity, but you can tell that they have character authenticity, it's hard for me to think that that's actually going to make a difference to utiles in the sense that the typical consequentialist would care about.
So two points with that, two problems. So one problem is, well, let me just specify that the world is that way, right? So let me just specify that the world is such that people prefer seeing performer authenticity. They prefer seeing a gay actor playing a gay role, and they derive immense joy from that. Let's just stipulate that. Then it follows that on a consequentialist view, at least, the actors have to suck it up and come out or not take the role. And yes, that has negative consequences for them, granted, but there's just so many more viewers than actors that it doesn't matter. So that's first problem.
So I actually just want to make a clarificatory point because I'm not actually sure that follows on a typical consequentialist view. I mean, if people say that they prefer that, that's one thing. But if it's a consequentialist view that's utilitarianism and adopts hedonism about well-being, then it doesn't actually matter whether people's belief about what they're seeing is true or false. Right. So it would be just as good if they falsely believe that there's performer authenticity if there's not on that specific view, which is a normative ethical view that I don't adopt. Now, you might say, and I take it you would, well, if you take desire satisfactionist account of well-being and you pair that with a certain type of consequentialist view that's utilitarian, maximizing utilitarian in nature, and then also make it that enough people have these desires, then you get the conclusion that it'd be morally impermissible to do that. And I would just say, like, yeah, that's true. I don't think that particular normative ethical view is plausible for a variety of reasons that I worry might take us too far astray from this conversation. But the conciliatory point I would just say is like, I could be wrong about normative ethics. It's hard. So if that view turned out to be true, and then the empirical facts are such, well, then yeah, that's true. That's just what we should. That's what we should do in that world, in that situation.
Yeah, I like that response. And I've remembered my second objection, which is related, which is basically that suppose that viewers find immense joy, which I think they do, in following the performances of certain performers. Um, there is this sort of trend within the queer community of following the performances of certain queer divas or certain queer personalities. You want to watch every movie they perform in. Um, and when they play the role of a queer character, there's this double glee, right? So you've got the initial glee of this queer performer is performing, double glee that they're performing a queer role when you've got the match. Lots of people experience that. That's consistent with hedonistic utilitarianism. Um, it seems like that's doing something good, right? It's improving the pleasure of people in the world. It's not leading to as strong a claim as the one that you're trying to reject, that this must be the case for every role, but it is the case that at least some of the time, it is the case that all the time when you've got these queer personalities playing queer roles, that it produces immense joy among the viewers who like those kinds of movies. Wouldn't we have a better world where that happened more often then?
Is more often all the time. So, I mean, one thing to say is, like, totally, I take your point. There's lots of cases where that's true. Here, it might be worth just prefacing my response with the thesis that Kurt and I argue. So, there's two interrelated claims that we make in the paper. The first is a very specific claim about whether fans, I should put in quotes, should hound performers on social media to try to force them to come out in the way that they did to Kit Connor. And the answer that we give there is no, right? And then there's an additional related question about whether straight performers should sometimes can sometimes be permissibly cast in roles where they're playing characters with a marginalized sexual orientation. Might be that gay or bisexual or pansexual or anything that falls under that broader category. And there we also say, yeah, that's fine. Sometimes there shouldn't be a deontic prohibition against straight performers playing characters with a marginalized sexual orientation. But that leaves room for um, a variety of context sensitive considerations that would entail that, like, in this production, you know, this audience would like to see this actor cast in this specific role for reasons X, Y, and Z. And among those reasons could be the ones that you just listed, Jason. And that might mean in a variety of particular cases, maybe even more often, I don't know, that would be a good thing to do. And that maybe that is what there's most reason, all things considered, to do in a variety of cases.
But you've put the utilitarian's foot in the door there, right? By saying, okay, well, if in this given case, including a queer performer in the role of the queer character would produce net positive utility for the world as a whole, for society as a whole, compared with not using a queer performer. And if that was the case in this particular performance, it would probably be the case in another performance and the next one and the one after that. Let's maximize utility, which is what the utilitarian wants. And Bob's your uncle. You've only got queer performers playing queer roles, and now it's morally obligated because that results in the best universe, the best world.
Yeah. Well, I think the reasons that I just gave are consistent with reasons that maximizing utilitarian of a certain type would adopt. But it doesn't entail that, because I'm not saying that those are the sole reasons that count in favor of doing that performance. And I think Kurt would, Kurt should weigh in on this, but I don't think he would want to say that those are the sole reasons either. The other thing is, I just think there's lots of examples where the types of considerations that you give apply to another character. To other popular actors as well. So, lots of people like to see Christian Bale do incredibly transformative performances in his role, and that'll bring them a bunch of extra joy, because look how different he is from the way you see him in his day-to-day life. And now look at him as Dick Cheney and all that he had to do to play Dick Cheney in Vice. And look at all the weight that he lost for the Machinists and all of these others. So I think in the real world, sometimes we would get that, and sometimes we would not get that. Or Robin Williams in The Birdcage. That's an example that we discuss in there.
So I do recognize the phenomenon you started with, that sometimes there's this kind of cult of personality, for lack of a better phrase, about the diva or the star, and then it does kind of resonate in that way. But I don't know if we could make a rule in that, because it seems that sometimes like we might really identify with one person who's really great, and then it turns out that performer actually doesn't really do so well with acting. And so like here I'm thinking of the Ryan White movie, right? Ryan White was very sympathetic as this AIDS education poster child. Everyone really, really identified with him, but he admits in his autobiography that he would be a horrible actor. And so when he goes and stars in the movie about his own life, of which there could be no greater authority than Ryan White, he wants to actually be the background character who mumbles like 7 lines. So I mean, I can see cases where yes, that resonance does happen, but in other cases, I guess I'm skeptical it's going to be easy to extend that to a rule, rather than like this would be great in the cases where it does, rather than this is the norm.
Fair enough, and I take your point. I'm thinking of cases of Larry David where it seems to help, but yeah, I'm sure there's cases where it doesn't. Um, I want to return to the trilemma. Um, how bad is it to force someone to come out before they're ready if they are playing the role of a queer character in a movie? Now, I take it that generally you don't want to force people to come out before they're ready as a general principle. I think that's a plausible principle. Um, but maybe this kind of circumstance is unusual. Why? Well, this is a public facing career, right? So this is a movie that they're acting in, it's a film, and they're public facing and they're trying to get an audience to buy in, to buy into their performance. They're trying to get an audience to suspend their disbelief when they watch it. There's a certain level of audience cooperation or participation that has to happen, that the actor is asking the audience to wait and see, not to just immediately say, I've seen that actor in another movie. That actor's not queer. I can't watch this. The the actor is asking the audience to suspend disbelief, to say, I've seen him before. He's not this particular character. He can't be playing this character because that's not who he is. They've got to buy into the possibility of this fictional world that's being generated. And so it's not entirely passive, the role that the audience has to play. And given that, I wonder whether it's not the case that the actor has some sort of obligations towards his audience as well. And given that, maybe he doesn't have an obligation to come out, but it sort of waters down the problematic nature of forcing him to come out. It reduces how bad it is because it's a public facing job.
Um, I mean, so I guess going back to one of the points you made a little bit earlier, about identifying with Will and Grace, and maybe argue it's a different time. I mean, so for me, it was a very similar experience, more with Dawson's Creek and Jack McPhee, just because he was closer in high school when I was coming out as well. And I think that all the benefits you listed there are true, of getting the audience to come into this world, of convincing them that this is what's going on in this character's life and being sympathetic with them. And that all seems perfectly consistent with saying, and that's why character authenticity is so important and is so paramount. And I think to go back to the point that Travis covered a little bit earlier that we had, um, it seemed that fans were perfectly happy with Kit Connors playing Nick Nelson. And if it really was that additional question of like, we could only be benefited if we knew that in real life Kit Connor was bi, then it seems like, why were you satisfied with this initial story? Why, when Heartstopper broke, did you really kind of fall in love with the character? And so I think I agree. And I agree with all the points you made about having this very compelling character, but I think that just kind of speaks to why it's so important to make sure the character authenticity is as strong as it absolutely can be. So we talk about like an epistemic obligation to learn about these instances. And so I know a lot of performers who take on these roles really do their due diligence to talk to family members or friends or read memoirs, biographies of people of what was it really like to come out? You did, and then like what was Christmas like coming from that? Because I came out as a straight person, but you coming out, it was your first time being out. And so I think it speaks, all those reasons are good and strong, but I think that all speaks again to character authenticity, not necessarily performer authenticity.
Yeah, I agree, of course. And the only thing that I'd add to that is I take it that it's a public facing role, and I also recognize that as a descriptive fact, celebrities have a lot less privacy in their public facing roles than they used to. And there's also a lot of people that think, in virtue of being an actor, um, you you do not have the same reasonable expectations about how you live certain parts of your life. So, one thing I'd say is, even if that's true, there's a question to be had about what sorts of things they still should be able to maintain privacy about and which ones they shouldn't. And I think divulging aspects of one's personal identity, like sexual orientation, should be among the things that say private. But I also, maybe just because I'm more old school in this respect, just think like celebrities should have the same amount of privacy as anyone else. I know that's not feasible. It's not realistic with companies like TMZ that can make a profit off of trying to find all of the personal details of their life in ways that are going to be shared. But I do think there's something bad about that, and that we should extend the same amount of respect towards their privacy that we would if it were somebody who was a completely private citizen. Um, while acknowledging in other public facing roles, maybe there's some things that matter. So, is Pete Hegseth an alcoholic uh, and going to have the nuclear codes? Like, well, then I think that part of your personal life matters because it's directly relevant to your very public facing and important job. But in general, I just want to say it should be still very private, even though it's in fact not, and that's not realistic for it to go back to being private.
So we might have different intuitions with different cases. So Kit Connor might be an unfair case for you to use because at the time he wasn't 18, and even if he was just 18, we don't think that it's cool to badger 18-year-olds about their sexual orientation, partly because most don't know yet what their sexual orientation is, and partly because they're just not equipped to defend that in the face of world attention. We might have a different intuition about a 35-year-old. Um, and I think what could be pushing people to agree with your intuition is the particulars of this case rather than the principle involved. Just to respond to something that you said, Travis, um, it's interesting that people generally don't have these expectations that celebrities should have the same level of privacy as the rest of us. It's interesting you have that intuition, but most people don't. Um, and I wonder why that is, especially in the case of actors. Maybe the reason is that they're playing the roles of characters where their privacy uh, is not kept from us. So when we watch Kit Connor's character, we see Kit Connor's character involved in kissing and having sex. Um, and so we feel like the actor has opened the door to that part of their life by discussing the character's life in that way and putting their body in that situation to represent it. So it seems like there is some sort of door there into the reasonable expectation of learning more about the performer. Maybe you could say, well, that doesn't fully justify learning more, demanding to learn more, but surely it at least provides some sort of prima facie interest or like some sort of ability to at least ask the question.
So I can see the kind of intuitive pull that you might be concerned that we're sort of trading on like the protecting the minor and the innocent, and not that. But I do think we might generalize it to lots of other cases. So in cases when somebody plays a person or character who is HIV positive, I think there'd be kind of an immediate I think, hesitation of outing that person's serious status one way or the other. We might say, like, well, look, they would have no comfortable saying I'm HIV positive or HIV negative, but it would be inappropriate, be prying to a point that's deeply personal, and not just because we have other norms around like sharing medical information, but just it wouldn't be acceptable to just say, like, well, you played a character who has HIV, I should be able to know whether you do or not. Um, I think that might be something where it wouldn't matter how old they are. So like I know Billy Porter was open about his serious status, but I think even in that case, if someone were to say, well, I don't actually know if he's played a character with it, but if he had, right, it would be, I think, it would be frowned upon if any like newspaper broke it before he had the chance to. But that might just be my intuition on that.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I mean, I take your point and I think it's true. I think you're right that there'll at least be a stronger judgment about the impermissibility of doing it to somebody like Kit Connor, who was 18 just when he came out, started playing as a minor, as Kurt had mentioned. Um, and part of the reason we chose that case was just because it was a salient recent case that was getting a lot of media attention. But we do talk about others in the paper that are a little bit more dated. So we discuss a story that Nathan Lane. I mean, this happened a while ago, but it was a recent article where he was recounting in the last couple of years how he was very happy to be able to act opposite Robin Williams in The Birdcage, and that when they went on Oprah to promote that, she had sort of not directly but indirectly pressured him to out himself by asking how he could play that role so well, and that Robin Williams was able to sort of steer the conversation away and then provide cover, since Robin Williams was a well-known straight man, um, for him to not come out. And I think when we think about the details of the Nathan Lane case, and I don't know how old he was in the early 90s, but I think he was probably in his 30s or so then too. He's still an older man, that the interdiction is still pretty strong, that it's permissible to do. But still, I agree, probably stronger in the case of a minor, likely because it's even more harmful when you force a minor to come out than when you force somebody whose brain is fully developed and they have had more life experience and perhaps more coping skills and a more built-in network of friends and family to lean on and so on.
I I really like the HIV positive case. I think that provides for me a more intuitive push against performer authenticity than the queer case, partly because I think the consequences of coming out queer today are quite different, maybe than they were a few decades ago, although there are cultures where it's not okay at all. It depends, I guess, where you live. But the consequences of coming out as HIV positive could be quite burdensome if that's not what you're wanting or expecting. I was thinking, what about this as an alternative rule? So the rule that you're objecting to, if I understand correctly, is the rule that only queer characters should play queer parts. In other words, there should be performer authenticity in all roles. That's, if I understand correctly, the view that you're objecting to. What if there was a refined version of that rule? And the rule was only only performers who have previously declared that this is part of their identity can apply for this role. That way, you're not forcing them to come out because they're not allowed to. They have to have done so before the role was advertised. So it doesn't give them access to the role by them coming out. So that's not an option that's available to them. They have to forgo the role if they had not come out previously, which is a pity that they can't play the role. But um, while that's a pity, it doesn't seem to infringe on their dignity in the way that it would be if they were forced to come out. That doesn't seem to be as bad or wrong. And there is the benefit that someone who really does understand what it's like gets to play the role.
I mean, I think one of the things that we talk about in the paper is sort of the bottleneck concern, is then that this seems like that rule would be forcing people to come out or not take these roles that by hypothesis they would be well suited to. And so I think if part of the goal isn't just about this match between performer and character, it's this idea that there should be more self-representation or community-led representation. It looks like you're now narrowing that because other people, because by default of the stipulation, you're requiring them to come out. You're already limiting people who would be maybe good at it but haven't come out publicly yet. And so I worry that that would be a kind of narrowing of the range of people and would be self-defeating by like the larger principles lights of we want more people in the community to have this kind of self-representation role. And perhaps that's one of the costs or the bullet that the advocate is willing to bite. That yeah, we don't want more people until they're already out. But I think that is going to put those two goals in tension of more representation that you're necessarily limiting by only those who are out.
Yeah, and the problem will get exacerbated when you think about roles that have intersectional uh, marginalized orientations, because then you do you have to does it is it one of it, or is it a majority, or do you need somebody who's out along each of these dimensions? And at that point it will be harder and harder to cast somebody who could do a really good job in the production, because acting's a really difficult discipline. And the best actors make it look easy, but really finding somebody who could fill some of these roles, especially the ones that are going to be um, more narrow and difficult to play, that's something where I think just for the sake of the art, you'd also want the widest applicant pool of talent possible. And that will just mean lots of productions that could get funding won't get funding, because I'm going to say you're not going to find somebody in, with the strictures of the social norms that's going to not cause controversy and hurt our bottom line, but also do a really good job in the role.
Okay, it's all very convincing. And before we started this discussion, I was saying to Kurt that it's hard to do this interview because I agree with your position, but I want to try, keep pushing. So, so far, all of the objections that I've given have tried to argue that your position is not inclusive enough. In other words, it's not pushing queer performers into queer roles. It's not inclusive in that sense. But one argument, a different argument, could be that it's too inclusive, because you are agreeing to the virtues of character authenticity. So you're saying that it's great that we have this representation in films and in TV of these gay characters, of these queer characters, and you support that. If that was the case, then why stop at queer characters? Why not insist on other types of characters as well? Why not insist on pedophilic characters? Why not insist on conservative characters that are often given a bad rap in movies? Why not insist on a whole range of other types of characters and demand that they get representation in movies just because they're underrepresented, perhaps compared with the range of characters represented generally?
So let me give a few qualifications that I don't know if you will find this satisfactory or not. I mean, so one thing that we say is that we do think there's a general epistemic, not moral, obligation for actors to ensure that there's character authenticity in um, many roles, particularly ones where that character will be taken to be representative of the group at large. So we do early on, as you know, because you kindly read the paper and gave us very helpful feedback. So I want to thank you publicly for that. We do early on say, look, there's a range of cases where they're not going to be taken as a stand-in for the group in question, and there people don't seem to even care about character authenticity, and rightly so. So we talk about the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix series, where he was the historical mass murderer, was not only gay but also a pedophile and a cannibal, and not good in other ways. And a straight actor played him, and no one seemed to care about that because we all know that Jeffrey Dahmer is not representative of the group at large. Or wild spoof films or two-dimensional characters. You mentioned Jeff is like a skeleton robot, or no, he's like a skeleton sidekick to Craig Ferguson, who was revealed to be gay in one skit. But no one seems to care about that because that's not taken to be representative. So we're actually narrowing to try to steelman our interlocutors. We were just trying to focus on the range of cases initially that they, by their own lights, they think character authenticity matters, and then making the case that there is this epistemic obligation. So I don't know if you're going to think that's cheating or not, but we are actually making a pretty limited claim about the range of roles that should have character authenticity from the get-go, which might but might avoid this implication that you think there is. But the other thing to say is just like, well, if the roles for a conservative calls for it, or a pedophile calls for it, if the role really would be benefited from character authenticity, sure, why wouldn't there be at least a general epistemic obligation for them to do that if the role calls for it?
Okay, so I wonder whether there's not a case for arguing that at least some of the time in these roles, character authenticity would be a bad thing and performer authenticity would be better. Um, I'm thinking specifically about portrayals of the gay community. So there's a subset of the gay community in real life, not in movies, who are highly promiscuous, love it, enjoy it. It's a very, very fun part of their lifestyle. Um, but whenever they're portrayed that way, even in a quite a watered down way that's not very authentic, um, there's there's an outcry among non-gay viewers that this is corrupting of society as a whole. It's threatening our community, and even among some gay viewers who are more conservative, they'll say, I just hate this part of the community that these people don't represent all of us. They're a scourge on our community. Even within the gay world, promiscuous gay men are seen as sort of the underbelly. And it seems like the more authentic that portrayal is, the more authenticity that character portrayal is, the worse the feedback is about about their lifestyles. In that case, it seems to be harming them more than anything to have character authenticity. But you might benefit from performer authenticity. So you might benefit from a promiscuous gay man playing a role like that who's aware of these sensitivities around community backlash against him from within the gay community and backlash from wider society as a whole. And so he reveals what he feels would be more socially acceptable and downplays other elements of his lifestyle um, in a way which perhaps someone who doesn't have that real life experience just wouldn't understand.
So no, I think that's a really interesting objection. And I think one of the things that might go into the character authenticity in that regard would be continuous with the epistemic objection. So representing as, look, we want to tell the story about someone who's in who goes to bathhouses or is on Grindr all the time. And we want to make sure that that representation is accurate. So one sort of stereotype is it's someone who's just sex crazed and like just goes from person to person to person. But reading sort of firsthand accounts or narratives of that, there's a kind of intimacy that shows up with there. So Andrew Sullivan talks about this, Tim Dean talks about this, not just within promiscuity communities, but also in terms of like bug chasing and gift giving. And so the idea is, I think, to accurately represent that, to have real character authenticity, you would have to talk with these communities. But also, I think that would come with the writer recognizing that this isn't the whole community. So part of that might be this commitment to having somehow worked into the character's dialogue or working into another character in the story who is a foil. So I think there's one risk that you mentioned earlier on about when the dominant view is the stereotype of gay men are promiscuous, and you sort of show like a movie like Al Pacino's Cruising, right? You're feeding into that exact stereotype. But it's like that's just a part of our community as well. And so I do sort of bristle when I think the way you phrased it was perfect, right? That's how a lot of conservative members of the community say, like, well, they like give all of us a horrible name, they should just cut it out. But I mean, I think that's just a kind of special pleading, and that's really not different than the way that we sort of get straight rebukes as well, right? You should just cut it out. You don't have to flaunt this in public. Like I see you holding hands with your gay agenda, right? And it's just like that's not much different than what we're doing here. So in a way, I'm very sympathetic to that kind of a concern to represent these not as the stereotype presents promiscuity, but also not as this is the emblematic face of the gay community. I think it's a community. It's full of individuals. Individuals are going to be very different. And to try and say, like, this is our face, like, it's just going to be a kind of special pleading. So I think that's a really important point to bring up.
I like that response. If I understand correctly, you're saying, well, if you have enough character authenticity, if you go all the way on that, that character will be represented in a way that's not going to produce these outcomes. But of course, it still might, right? People don't always respect the nuance of the role. They don't always see the intentions of the movie maker, of the actor. They don't get it, and they just see something that disagrees with their general moral stance or their conservative views, and they react. And I have maybe a dimmer view of humanity than you do, Kurt. I think people, they react from the hip almost. They fire moral outrage from the hip without really thinking twice about it. And if it just sniffs of something that threatens their moral outlook, they they don't watch the rest of the movie. They just fire. Um, and that may be damaging to that sector of the community. It may just be too authentic for the world at the time.
No, so I was laughing. I'm usually accused of being like an eternal, unflinching optimist. So I'm glad that comes out here too. No, I think there is that concern, but I guess I do have more faith in the ability for people to see and be compassionate and empathetic and change. And I think the history of evolving media representation shows that they can. Maybe not all at once, maybe not, well, in season one, we lost all these viewers, but I think it's a mistake to expect that kind of change to happen overnight or even in one episode or one season or one show. I think you start to see people change maybe at the center and then center right and then maybe right. So if you go back and wind the clock to basic political discourse in the 90s about marriage equality, right? It was gay people are just promiscuous. They couldn't possibly do it. We need marriage to tame and domesticate gay people. And now, when I ask my students, like, what about gay marriage? Like, they can't remember a time when gay marriage wasn't legal. And so, they're like, when I ask them like that, there's this question of, like, well, should they just stay single until they meet the right person? Or, like, maybe marriage isn't for everyone, or people just kind of like their lives. But there's almost this, like, what do you mean you shouldn't be allowed to kind of a moment? And so, I do see your worry that especially in the digital age, people are going to react and then like react even more to make sure that everyone knows that they have this view. But and maybe it's naive, but I do think people do change, and I think we have evidence to believe that, even if it's bit by bit. So if we're hoping that a kind of deeply held social prejudice is going to evaporate, I don't think it's going to happen soon, but it does happen. But again, maybe the rosy cheeks are conveying the naivety. I don't know, but
Yeah, I really like that answer. I mean, I hate optimism generally, but you sold me. Um, and I think the argument that, well, if people had taken my position when it came to, let's say, Will and Grace, yeah, there would have been enormous outrage, and they would have expected that going into filming. But it was definitely a good thing that it happened. It adjusted the world. It was a good thing that Ellen came out. These were good things. Um, Travis, what is the strongest objection to your view?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We consider a number of objections that we think are the strongest at the end. If I had to pick one, um, I do think the worry about, Kurt might have a different view about what's the strongest, but I think the worry about taking away roles from marginalized characters um, is an important one. And it's an empirical question whether that'll happen. Now, we give arguments to think that that's not going to be the case, and I'm more confident that those are right than they are wrong. But if the empirical evidence turned the other way, and it suggested that it was, aside from the bottleneck concerns that we raised, aside from the concerns about deterring people from getting into the industry in the first place if they have a marginalized sexual orientation, if it turned out that what it meant in effect was people with a marginalized sexual orientation were just being boxed out of roles that they would otherwise get and excel at, then I think that would be strong reason to put a much heavier emphasis on performer as well as character authenticity. And what we have to say in the paper is admittedly necessarily somewhat speculative. I think it's reasonable. I think it's right. But of course, how that bears out will really affect where I would go for the argument.
Kurt, you agree with that? By the way, I ran your article through ChatGPT, and it came up with that concern as the chief concern as well. So ChatGPT said, while it may be true that a rule like this would be a bad rule to always include queer actors as queer characters, it's the case that when you do include queer actors as queer characters, you are doing something good. And it said that even if that violates some sort of norms, it is the case that getting more queer actors into roles would be a good thing. And over time, that good could outweigh the the harms that you're discussing. I think the right way of you dealing with that objection is through the bottlenecking response, because that points in the opposite direction. That actually, if you were to implement a rule like this, then it would harm gay actors.
So I guess the strongest objection was probably one of the most common ones I got when we were initially talking about this, was sort of how does it extend to other groups? And so one of the things we take up at the end is the question of, say, Gentiles playing Jewish characters. And I think, again, one of the things we try to say is this is a case study. We get a few general conclusions, but I think there's a kind of rush or indignation to then say, like, well, what about all of these other examples that are clearly wrong? And I think we try to introduce a mutatis mutandis condition, where if there are these relevant similarities, then we can get these extension cases quite nicely. And if there are these important differences, say in a history of oppression or a history of representation and controlling images, it's not going to generalize, and that's a virtue, it's a feature, not a bug, of the account. And so, like, we focus a little bit on cases of I think I'm blanking on the actress's name, but she plays Midge Maisel, and she plays a couple of other Jewish characters, but she herself is not Jewish. And so obviously there can be concerns that have been raised. I think Sarah Silverman raised some about other characters, but I think, again, this is going to come down to the question of character authenticity, of sort of how well are you representing the group that you're taking on. And I think we do address that head on. It's sort of an uncomfortable point when people would first kind of pitch it to me, but I think that's one of the things that we really try to end strong on in the paper.
So if I understand correctly, really it's character authenticity that's doing the work, right? So that's what makes it a good performance. And insofar as someone can argue that performer authenticity is required for character authenticity, you would agree, but you just don't agree that it's required. You think that any performer with the right level of research and ability and talent can perform that role with character authenticity, so it's not required. But if it was required, in order to perform the role well, you'd be more sympathetic to that position?
So I think in our sort of approach to this, yeah, we tried to show that in queer characters, it doesn't seem to be this requirement given the sort of historical evidence that we provide in section 1. And so again, the question of generalizing to other groups or case studies will sort of depend on the particular moral features and a number of other, I think, really complicated empirical factors that we didn't really have a ton of time to go into in the paper. But I think, at least in these cases, we've shown that it's not necessary for queer performers to only play queer characters to ensure character authenticity.
Yeah, but I mean, to your question, if it were required, we argue that it's not, and we give many examples where we think they just decisively show that it's not actually required. But if it were, then yeah, we think that, or at least I would think that that would count much more strongly in favor of that. But the other sort of nuanced point that I think is worth bringing in is to say that it's not required isn't to say that it could never matter in any sort of context at all.
Mm.
Not that you implied that, not that anyone suggested that, but just to be clear, I think there's a reasonable case to be made that having some first-person experience of what it's like to be a member of the marginalized group in question could, in many instances, make it, help one achieve character authenticity. But it just won't. That's one part of a series of tools that you could use to get there, and it's not a necessary tool in every case. And as the Ryan White case shows, that I think Kurt mentioned earlier, even somebody that has that tool to a greater extent than anyone else, no one's more like Ryan White than Ryan White is, doesn't necessarily mean that they'd be the most equipped to enact character authenticity on camera, because acting's hard. Like, you know, I couldn't play myself. A seasoned actor could do a much better job playing me and realizing it on screen than that's one. If Christian Bale could turn into Dick Cheney, he could morph himself into me. Just want to be clear on my biopic. I want Dick Cheney. I mean, I want Christian Bale. I want Dick Cheney. Actually, no, I want Dick Cheney to play me.
Maybe someone could argue it's neither necessary nor sufficient for the performer to actually be queer to play the role well. But it helps, as you say, at least some of the time, it helps. And it could be that it helps in ways that are different from the virtues of the performance of the non-queer performer. So perhaps the non-queer performer would do a stellar job, but just not the same job as the queer performer. Maybe they're like different in important ways. And because they're different in important ways, maybe by not forcing a queer performer into that role, you're foregoing the possibility of having those types of authenticity portrayed? Or do you think there is no such thing? There is no level of empathy that is inaccessible to a performer. They can get the whole thing. They can perfectly play a gay character um, in every possible way. Or do you think there's at least something that's inaccessible to them potentially?
So I think in the queer cases, I think I think it will be hard pressed to say what that relevant moral difference would be. Um, and I think that that's one of, in fact, virtues of the account, is that you're trying to learn so much about the community, and you're trying to learn so much about the character's particular backstory as it would correlate to the real world, that you could make it so as if like this was exactly what it was supposed to be. And so I think that's one of the things, I know, at least for me, that I sort of found wanting in the kind of claims of, well, we need performer authenticity because it just somehow infuses the character with this, I don't know what, but it's something. And when you try to start spelling out what that something is, I think there's a litany of counterexamples in the real world that show it just doesn't have to be there. And I think that's one of the virtues of bringing in members of the marginalized group as, say, consultants for writing, or as sort of going with online resources. It lets them contribute to the production in a way that doesn't force them to only be so as performers. So, like, not to go back to the Ryan White example, but he was a consultant. He was able to say, this is what I know. I read about this in the book, but this is what it felt like when I turned on the radio and like the townspeople were accusing my mother of being a horrible mother. Like it just really sucked, and like this is how I did react. I didn't talk about that in um, the biography, but here it is. And so I guess I would struggle to see what is that additional contribution that in principle could not show up in this other one. I don't know if that's how Travis sort of also thought about the issue or not.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'm 100% on the same page. One thing that I'll note, which is perfectly consistent with that too, is I think you're right that different actors would approach it differently. But I think that's just a general fact about any individual who's acting. There's so many choices that you can make, maybe an infinite number of like tiny differences and just different mannerisms and a different look, that every actor is going to do something different. If you watch the same actor perform a live production multiple times, as I have been lucky enough to do on a few occasions, even an actor, 1 year later will do things that are different than they did 1 year before. Those could be conscious choices, they could be subconscious choices, right? They might not be choices at all. I think the test for this sort of challenge is have multiple performers perform the same role, some of whom are members of the marginalized group, some of whom are not, and have an audience who's unaware about what the actor's actual identity is, try to pinpoint if they can find this ineffable quality that makes one better or not. They'll find differences for sure, and they might be able to rank in terms of performances that they like, in terms of quality or even just subjective preference. But I suspect that there would not be this indescribable special feature or something that's necessarily going to come out with professional actors that are members of the group and those that are not, even if, as you said before, it can help in some cases.
Well, Kurt and Travis, thank you so much for joining us to talk about queer actors and queer performances. Listeners, if you agree, feel free to comment on Spotify or YouTube. We do read your comments. And if you have any further suggestions for topics that are related to this or unrelated to this, feel free to post a comment on YouTube or on Spotify. Thank you again, both of you, for appearing on the show, and you're both very welcome back. Travis is a frequent flyer, and he'll be back again shortly for a different topic.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. If you disagree, please feel free to send Kurt all the hate mail.
My email is travis.timmerman@Seton Hall University, so please, all there. But no, this was a pleasure and an honor. It was great to finally actually be on the show and to talk with you. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for having me.